Thanks, everyone. Great to be with you. Keep the faith, stay with us, and then have a drink afterwards. I'm delighted to be joined for this session at this point at the end of such an eventful day by President Stubb of Finland. Many of you will know that he is one of the most interesting thinkers about, I think, the geopolitics of the new era that we live in. And his country lives in uncomfortable proximity to the cause of so much discussion across policy, across security and defence here in Munich and beyond. So I'm going to just dive in. Welcome, President Stubb.
Thank you.
Very
nice
much
to be here again.
For joining us. Give me your response, if you could, to Secretary Rubio's appearance. Somehow around in these halls, I've heard a mixture of, well, this is a very different tone to last year, much more conciliatory, Europe, we love you, culturally, you're kind of cool. But at the same time, the message also echoed J.D. Vance last year to the extent of saying sort of Europe needed to step up on its own security. And there was quite a lot of criticism in there about the way that European societies have developed. How did you read this speech?
Well, probably two observations. One is that I think we brought down the temperature in the transatlantic relationship, certainly from Davos, where the focus was a lot on Greenland. And then probably the speech was different in tone than J.D. Vance's speech last year. I had a chance to talk to Marco about it for about half an hour right after the speech, so we gave a little bit of an analysis. But the second observation is to say, I think what we need to understand is that American foreign policy has changed, and the definition of it is not only in Marco's speech and JD's speech, but also in the national security strategy from November 2025. And that speech kind of has two strands. One is ideological, it's very MAGA. So MAGA means anti-EU, it means anti-liberal world order, it means anti-climate change, that's the ideological undercurrent. And then the second sort of strand or pillar of the national security strategy, which you could hear a little bit of in Marco's speech today as well, is America first. And that's a pecking order. Number one is the Western Hemisphere, and Marco is very strong about that. Number two is the Indo-Pacific. Someone like Colby is quite strong on that. And then number three is Europe, number four is the Middle East, and number five is Africa. So when you put this ideology and policy together, I think you pretty much see where the US foreign policy stands at the moment.
So you mentioned Greenland, and it doesn't seem things change so fast at the moment. The cycle is moving fast. At Davos, we ended up in that midweek where 1 minute we was halfway to the US declaring it would have Greenland in some form territorially, and then what looked like a bit of a climb down from that position, and clearly a massive diplomatic effort here in Europe by leaders to placate President Trump on that score. In a nutshell, where did we end up?
Well, I think we had three scenarios when it all started, pretty much during the weekend, right before Davos. And the first scenario was good, the second one was bad, and the third one was ugly. And the good scenario was to try to come up with an off-ramp where we would set up a process to increase Arctic security and hopefully get something at the NATO Ankara summit. The bad scenario was a trade war and an increase of tariffs. Remember that there were 8 countries that were threatened with tariffs up to 25%. And then the ugly scenario was a continuation of a military threat. And I think we were able to take scenario 2 and 3 off the table and focus on number 1. And of course, we speak about this a lot with European colleagues, and certainly with Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen and the Prime Minister of Greenland. It's not over yet, but again, we're back into Arctic temperatures on this, so we're not talking.
Well, at least you're more used to them then.
We are. When I left Finland, it was -10 and snow, and in Helsinki, you had this much snow on the trees, so it was lovely.
I was going to say that's hardened you up. But just on the last point on that before we move on, do you think, are you in that camp that says President Trump had a point here, Arctic security? It was something had been bubbling along, Europeans were aware of it and were suddenly confronted by it in that bracing way that the Trump administration does. Did Europe need to get an Arctic shock?
Well, I don't know whether we needed it or not, but it was a good exercise of how do you escalate to de-escalate, and who do you contact and who you discuss with. I think, of course, the lead was taken very much by Mark Rutte on this, in close coordination with the Danes and the Greenlanders. And I think what happened was that the escalation part was very much out of the public. So it was making sure that there's an understanding how much of the bond market in the US is European. There's an understanding of what the ACI instrument is. There's an understanding of how much of the US stock market is European owned. So Europe actually has all the cards or the instruments in these types of situations. And the other one then was to try to find the de-escalatory language. And I think we succeeded in that. But, I would be lying, and you know me, I'm an avid transatlanticist and pro-American and pro-European. So I'd be lying if I said it didn't leave a scar. Of course it does when you're talking about fundamental issues such as territorial integrity and sovereignty. But now we have a couple of processes, and I'm carefully optimistic that we'll land it in the right place.
We heard Yulia Navalnaya earlier here on stage talking to my colleague Gordon Rapinski, after that proof was forthcoming today, very joined up effort there by a number of European countries, clearly based on their analysis and intelligence services about the cause of death and the poisoning, fatal poisoning, as they have proven it, of Navalny. In some ways, it solves a horrible mystery. It's a surprise that isn't a surprise, but even so, the details of it are just so shocking and disturbing. Because I made the comment that you're living in Finland in cozy proximity, but so what difference do you think it makes? Because we go through these cycles of being a sort of shock about Putin, and then things get worse, and the war continues, of course, in Ukraine. What do you take away from a day like this in terms of the risk factor that you think Putin poses?
Well, I mean, it's obviously a big question. I try to read a lot, and I just finished a book on Russian revisionist history by a BBC journalist called Sixsmith, and it basically went through, why Russia is using the language it is on Ukraine, and how Putin has developed his thinking from the 1990s through to 2000, how he changed his language early on in this century, and took it from there. And I think the big things that we have to understand that the DNA of Russia, unfortunately, as a state, is an empire, and the DNA is imperialism. So it has often been about land acquisition. And then you have to try to understand Putin, who is a rational individual, what his thesis is. Well, his thesis is that Ukraine as a state shouldn't exist. His thesis is Ruski Mir, Great Russia, which means one Russia, one language, one religion, and one leader. And this is his perspective and his thinking. And it's not only this day, it was yesterday, it was last week, last month, last year, etc.
I guess, just to push you a little further on
Sure.
that, what you say is right and thoughtful and reflective. But when we see, just something like the use of poisoning of a key enemy like Navalny, it was clearly, that was part of a trajectory of antagonism, hostility, in the end being prepared to murder an adversary. But when you, as I say, if you're living in Finland or you're talking to European countries here now in this state, we talk about hybrid war, which in some ways I think is quite sort of cold language. It's quite hard maybe to say to populations how dangerous this is. I suppose I'm asking, when you hear of something like that today, do you feel fearful for yourself vis-a-vis Russia? Do you think we underestimate that?
No, I would certainly not draw parallels on that. But what we do have to understand is that human life for someone like Putin or the Russian administration is secondary. And we're not only talking about Navalny. Just give you an example of what's happening in the battlefield right now. In Ukraine, there were 35,000 soldiers, Russian soldiers, that the Ukrainians killed in December. There were 30,000 in January. That's 65,000 dead soldiers in 2 months. Compare that to the Soviet Union and Afghanistan in the 1980s. That was 10 years and 18,000. So what I'm trying to say is that for Putin, the human life is irrelevant, and that's the take that you have to do. So he'll go to the limit to what he does. On hybrid warfare, it's a reality that we live with. So, some people like Mark Leonard talks about the age of unpeace. So you have kinetic warfare and then you have hybrid warfare. Kinetic warfare is taking place right now in Ukraine. We don't feel the threat of kinetic warfare coming to Finland at our border because we have one of the largest armies in Europe and we're members of NATO. But hybrid warfare is something we deal with every day. It can be sabotage, it can be Litvinenko, it can be Navalny, it can be a cable in the Baltic Sea.
I just wanted to turn to that. Just in the time that we have, it's kind of round the defence world in 20 minutes. Let's look at that as an example. And there's attacks, and they built up, and I think before it sort of really became part of the regular news cycle. Well, there's attacks on cables in the Baltic. Now, I know that was one of, I think it was the 31st of December, the last one was the last day of the year, last significant one that there've been many.
Christmas Day the year before that.
Christmas, it's always nice to get it's always nice to get a present at the end of the year, isn't it, from Moscow. But when you look at that, do you feel that, certainly your position in Poland vis-a-vis Baltic states, but also the wider NATO community, has got what they need there? I mean, there's still a sense, like legally, there are some holes here about what you can do once you've actually, you've found out what's happening, you're able to, you know what it is, you know about the shadow fleets. Is there still a legal hole about getting, basically bringing these people to justice and then being able to say, we did this?
Well, to a certain extent there is, but we abide by the rule of law. And in the case of Eagle S, which happened on the 25th of December 2024, I think that was a great example of how Finnish authorities work. They basically asked the ship to come from international waters to Finnish water, and then they were able to confiscate it and pursue the necessary means. But with hybrid warfare, it's actually quite difficult to defend. But I'll give you 3 very quick examples. Russia has been instrumentalizing asylum seekers, so sending asylum seekers across the border. So the Finnish government legislated a law which gave us the means to react to this. We haven't had to use it, but once we legislated, that stopped. So there are no asylum seekers coming. Secondly, on the cables, whether Russia did it or not, I'm not taking issue with attribution here. NATO set up a Baltic sentry operation. After that, we basically haven't seen serious cable cutting anymore. And then, of course, on the drones or the violations of our airspace, we've seen Eastern Sentry. So, you do a countermeasure and try to stop it. But I think we in Finland are quite calm about this. As President of Finland and Commander-in-Chief, I'm the only person who gets all the information about our security, from the border to the defense, to our operations, to our security of supply, to our police, et cetera, et cetera. And when I look at the way in which our system works, and when I go into the Situation Room, I come out of there and I can sleep quite calmly at night. I'm not worried at all.
Maybe you've just got a good temperament.
No, I don't think so. We Finns are quite cool.
Finnish, isn't it?
Well, yeah, but these guys are just doing such a phenomenal job that I can't be bothered to worry.
Okay. Yeah, that's good news. I was interested in that. I mean, how much, since you joined NATO, how much have you seen those measures from Russia mount up, whether it's in cyber, particularly, I was going to say probably cyber more than propaganda attacks on the Baltic states are probably a bit rather different. There might be a bit of a waste of time in Finland, given the view of society. But is there a difference? And can you tell us here a little bit? Can't read out your entire security report that you get every night in a box, no doubt, or in a file. But can you just give us a sense of how different it is now that you're in NATO and how that has affected Russia's response?
Well, I think for us as Finland and NATO as an alliance, our membership was very much win-win. We're security providers rather than security consumers. If you look at the 4 largest militaries around our part of the world, it's basically Turkey, Poland, Finland, and then, of course, Ukraine. When it comes to intelligence, when it comes to air, land, and sea defense, when it comes to cyber, we basically got this. There's a reason why we have 25,000 NATO soldiers in an exercise next week in northern Norway and northern Finland. They want to learn about how we do it in Arctic conditions. From a Russian perspective, of course, they changed their attitude, because for them, NATO was basically...
How was that noticeable?
Well, there's some, information stuff that's different. Of course, we still have our diplomatic channels. NATO is very much a no-go. But I think our NATO profile is a little bit like Norway's. So we're not going to be on the good guys' side with the Russians for a while. We see cyber attacks. I mean, you know, they try, but they don't really succeed. But information wars we have to be very careful with. And this comes into also media and social media, how we handle this.
I'm interested you say keep diplomatic channels still to an extent, because that's an area where a lot of, since effectively the beginning of the full-on war in Ukraine, in 22 lot of European countries have either, you've had to make that decision. There are some worries about not having channels and having to rely perhaps on military channels which may or may not connect, particularly to avoid escalations you don't want. Can you say a little more about Finland's role there?
I can say to a certain point. I can't tell you the full story. So the certain point is to say that by diplomatic relations, I mean the Russian embassy in Helsinki vis-a-vis our foreign ministry. They are communication channels. I get really good reporting from our Moscow embassy, Finnish embassy in Moscow from different types of events. Then, of course, when it comes to border guards, it's clear we have 1,340 kilometers of border. The connection has to be there. So there are different types of channels, but on the top level, it's difficult, really impossible to have a relationship right now.
So we're heading towards the end of our conversation. When I started the day looking at Keir Starmer's speech, he was very much talking there about, you know, echoing a lot of calls for a stronger European security identity. You know, we can't rely on the USA anymore. But how far can Europe go it alone in defence and security without the USA?
Well, it depends on which country you ask. I mean, a country like Finland, which has a sizable military, I get a little bit tired of repeating this, but we have 1 million men and women who have done their military service and training in Arctic conditions. We have 61 F-18s. We just bought 64 F-35s. We have long-range missiles, air, land, and sea, and we have the largest artillery in Europe together with Poland. And as I say, we don't have this because we're worried about Stockholm, right?
Which is the great relief of any Swedes in the room.
Not even after we beat them in the Olympics in ice hockey 4-1 yesterday.
Just saying.
Just saying. But they did do very well in the women's relay today. So congratulations for their silver. But you see what I'm trying to do, of course, is to push away the actual answer. So of course, you know, if you ask the binary question, do Finnish Hornets or F-35s fly without American software? No, they don't. But am I worried about this? No, I'm not, because there is this military integration which we established with the US before we became NATO members in the early 1990s. And the bilateral defense cooperation that we do with the United States right now is better than it has ever been. So let's just continue to work on this transatlantic partnership and you know, it's in transition, I fully understand that, but when it comes to security interests, it is in the interest of the United States to have very strong defense forces in Finland, Sweden and Norway.
Any plans for another round of golf with Donald Trump
right now I'm practicing indoors. I mean, I actually stopped golf cold turkey 35 years ago, so I should probably thank President Trump for getting me back into it. It's quite fun, and nowadays the clubs are a little bit easier than the persimmon woods that I played with in the 1980s.
Well, that was very nice, and thank you for going those rounds with me. Very much enjoyed it.
Thank you.
President Stubb of Finland, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks.